Okay, in this presentation, we want to turn our attention to Saturn's moons. And what we're going to see is that actually some of the moons of Saturn are, in some ways, as interesting as the planet itself. Now, Saturn has many moons that appear to be made of water ice, but in addition to these small moons, Saturn has 6 medium-sized moons, and some of them are quite large. And then it has one really large moon, Titan. And Titan is almost the large. Remember, Jupiter has Ganymede, which is the largest moon in the solar system. Well, Titan is almost that big. And so Titan actually has some things about it that are really interesting. One of the most interesting things about Titan is that it has a thick atmosphere. So it's a rocky moon, but it's got an atmosphere that clings around it. And it's not just, like this thin, wispy atmosphere. It's a dense, thick atmosphere held to the moon by the moon's gravity. In fact, this atmosphere is so thick that it makes imaging the surface of the moon essentially impossible to see with visible light. Now, the atmosphere of Titan is chemically complex, but of course, since it is an atmosphere, we're going to do one of these graphs, and you can see the different layers of the atmosphere. And here is something that you can see in this graph that is interesting. In this lower corner, it's indicating that there is methane rain. There is actually rain on the surface of Titan. Now, because Titan is so far away from the sun, it's incredibly cold. So this rain is not made out of water like the rain on the Earth. It's actually made of methane. Now, on the Earth, because the Earth's temperature is relatively much hotter, methane and ethane, the things that are in the atmosphere of Titan, they would be volatile gases on the Earth. But on Titan, because it's so cold, they condense into liquids. And indeed, there are these big clouds of methane droplets which eventually condense and form rain on the surface of the moon. So this is another place in our solar system besides the Earth where there is rain, something that's very familiar to us, and yet, because it's so different, also very alien. Now, we have been able to see some of the surface features not by looking at the visible, but by looking at the infrared. And again, we've talked about this many times, that this is really the advantage of being able to look at different parts of the spectrum. Sometimes you can't see something with visible light, but you can see it with other parts of the spectrum. But even this is limited, and so if you really want to see what the surface of the planet looks like, you have to go there. And so we did. Many years ago, we launched a probe which took several years to get to Saturn. It was called the Cassini probe, and the Cassini probe had another little spacecraft that actually landed on the surface of Titan, and that was the Huygens spacecraft. Cassini and Huygens were both famous scientists that studied Saturn, and so those crafts were named in their honor. But when the Huygens probe landed on the surface of the moon Titan, it found this. Here we see some actual photographs taken from the Huygens probe as it descended and then later landed on the surface of Titan. And there are some really startling things here. Let's look at the picture on the right, because this is really crazy. We see boulders on the surface of the planet. But here's what's startling. Here, when people first saw these pictures, they were like stunned by them, because they recognized these boulders are smooth. They're not jagged. And the way that you get smooth boulders on Earth is through the process of erosion. And as they looked, they see not just smooth boulders, but they also see these images of channels. And they actually were able to see things like lakes. There are these huge lakes of liquid methane on the surface of Titan. So in many ways, what we see on Titan is very familiar to us. There is weather, there is rain, there are rivers and lakes, and there's geological activity that's able to cause erosion. It's just really familiar to us in a lot of ways. and that's kind of startling. Here we see our best understanding of what the interior of Titan looks like. One of the things that is noteworthy here is that just like Europa, which is around Jupiter, Titan may have liquid water under its surface, and so that could be a place where we might find some form of life. And not just that, on the surface, we have these lakes and these rivers of liquid methane and ethane, and these volatile chemicals can act like water. They can dissolve the biological compounds and let them mix, which is why water is so important for life on Earth, because that's what water does. It dissolves things and lets them mix together and have chemical interactions. Well, similar chemistry might happen on the surface of Titan. So there may be some form of life on the surface of Titan that is completely alien to us because it doesn't use water as its chemistry basis. It uses uh, liquid methane as its solvent, which enables these chemical compounds to mix. And so that is something that is very interesting and worth exploring. Now, Titan, of course, is a very gigantic moon, but as I mentioned previously, there are several medium-sized moons. This image is a really nice image. It shows all the moons, all the medium-sized moons of Saturn in compared to the size of the Earth's moon being over here on the left. And so you can see these different moons and their shapes and surface features. When we look at these moons, we find that several of them are tidally locked, and we know what that means. Just like the Earth's moon, they always show the same face to their planet because the time it takes for them to rotate around their axis is the same time it takes for them to go around the planet. And they're at different distances away. Now, of these other moons, maybe the most interesting one is Enceladus, which is oddly youthful in its surface. We know what that means when we talk about the surface of a planet or a moon being old or young. We talk about how there's geological activity to reshape and reform the surface. And so, for example, the impact from different asteroids aren't as visible because they get eroded away by the geological activity. Now, there are a few things that are interesting about Enceladus. One of them is you see these fissures here and the lower hemisphere, and that's actually called the tiger claw because it looks like a tiger clawed into the surface. And but what's interesting about the tiger claw is that it's very warm. Now, it would of course be freezing compared to the Earth, but compared to the rest of the moon, it's many degrees higher in this region, and that's indicating that there's some sort of geological activity, some sort of heat within the moon. And of course, we know that this is probably being caused by the tidal forces from Saturn causing the moon to flex and stretch, just like we talked about happened with the moons of Jupiter. Now, what's really interesting about the moon Enceladus is that it has geysers. It has geysers that spray water up into the height above it, and then it basically falls back down as snow. But what's interesting is that this is coming from the interior of the planet where there may be liquid water and may be life. And so it's been proposed that this might be a very easy, relatively speaking, easy mission to try to accomplish, to look for biological compounds and signs of life, is to basically just send a probe and fly it through one of these geysers and collect samples. Because if there is evidence, it might be found there. And so that's something that people have thought about doing, which would be very, very interesting if we were to find that, because even if we don't find life, it would tell us maybe something more about what the inside of this moon looks like. But of course, the prospect that we might actually find life in these geysers, some signs of life in these geysers, that would be very, very exciting for scientists and astronomers around the world. The last thing that I want to mention is kind of a curiosity, but two of the smaller moons of Saturn actually share the same orbit. And so you can see, if I follow this moon, for example, it comes around here, it goes around, but when it comes around here, it crosses over and becomes in the inside orbit. The moon that was in the inside orbit crosses over to the outside orbit. And so these moons are exchanging their orbits as they go around Saturn, and that's kind of interesting, I think. But anyway, that's quite a bit about the moons of Saturn, and I hope you found some of it interesting. And that will be the last thing that we want to talk about for Saturn.